couple of announcements for you today as we get started. One, I wanted to say thank you to all those who have been participating on our Wednesday nights during Lent together. We've got a meal each Wednesday night at 5:15. I want to say thank you to those who generously supported the high school group on their mission trip. So they raised over $850 for their mission trip this summer. And then, so we thank you for that. And we also invite you to worship at 6 and 7 each Wednesday night. Our theme is Conversations with God, and there's dramas with key people from Jesus' life. And we're also having Holden evening prayer. And one other piece from the announcements I want to draw your attention to is that there's a concert here at church Tuesday night. It's from Bethel College. It's their orchestra, their chamber orchestra, right here in this space, 7 o'clock Tuesday night. Great opportunity to invite a friend to join you and come back here Tuesday night for a wonderful concert. Now we're going to hear an introduction to our theme as we look at John. Midst of our sermon series on John, the Gospel of Light and Life. Last week, Pastor Dennis introduced that with looking at the first chapter of John, the Word made flesh. Today we're looking at the miraculous signs of Jesus, and then that will continue all the way through looking at eternal life on Easter Sunday. You can see that there's 1 week there that will take a pause from the sermon series as we're inviting in the pastor from the congregation that's meeting at the Anamosa prison to speak with us in 2 weeks. So that will also be a very meaningful time together. So as we look at John, we're also given some clues to the meaning of the whole of John as we're looking at this. And so we're looking at the fact that all of John, the stories lifted up, particularly the signs we're looking at today, are all about the goal of believing in who Jesus is and in receiving life, the life that Jesus gives. So all the signs, all the miracles point to that. And in John, Jesus uses the term sign to talk about the miracles of Jesus. And so here is a sign. It's not the most extravagant one, but it's a sign pointing to a hike. It names the hike, and it shows an arrow pointing to the hike. And when I was finishing up my internship in a congregation similar to our intern Alyssa did last summer, I was finished with my seminary education, and I had some time. And I also happened to have a friend that lived in Hawaii. And so I had free lodging, a free car if I needed it, a place to stay. And so I went, and a friend of mine joined me, and we stayed with them in their house, and we did a lot of hiking. And this particular sign points to a hike, but that's not the most exciting thing I saw on that hike, right? There was more to it that was pointing the way to an adventure that we were going to have. Similar to miracles in John, they point to something more significant than even the miracle themselves. And the miracles in John are much more exciting than that sign. But again, the idea that it points to something more significant than what even is happening. And so for this hike, for instance, right, the sign pointed to it, and some hiking signs will even have a map, and you can kind of get a few more clues from it. But you didn't quite see the whole waterfall that we got to see as we made our way, right? Or the adventure and struggle of kind of making it way through a bamboo forest on the way, and the mud we had to trek through, and the way we had to kind of climb up part using a rope, and then it pointed, but it wasn't in it itself, to the view we saw when we got there, where we saw the beautiful valley, and you could see the ocean on the far side. And so the sign pointed in the direction to go, pointed the direction of the adventure, but the life and the beauty and the wonder and the adventure of that was experienced in following the direction of the sign. And so as we're looking at miracles in John, and actually a lot of the stories within John, they point us to something more significant than the thing itself. So as we look at the stories, there's kind of the surface meaning of the story. We're following the actions of Jesus. And then there's a deeper meaning, which is pointing to the meaning of Jesus' life. So if you look at the details as clues, we can think, well, why does John mention that? What is John trying to teach us about who Jesus is? So again, kind of pointing to that same that is bigger. So as we read the Gospel of John, we're asking ourselves a few questions. Who is this man Jesus? How does this affect my life? And what response am I called to? So a few questions as we look at that. And there's 7 signs mentioned in the chapters 2 through 12. This is sometimes called the Book of Signs. And we're going to dive kind of into 2 of those a little bit more today. So the first miraculous sign is found in John chapter 2. It's a wedding miracle where Jesus changes water into wine. So we hear in John chapter 2, on the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, but then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So on the surface, this is an event, right? They ran out of wine, and Jesus saves the day by changing the water into wine. But as we look at kind of clues for a deeper meaning to what's happening, what does the sign point to? What is John trying to help us see? We see clues as to who Jesus is and what life means, what his life means. So again, there were 6 jars, with 20 to 30 gallons in each one, and they were at a party, a wedding party. So I don't know if any of you, the last time you brought wine to a party, maybe how much you brought with you. Maybe not even 1 gallon, right, of wine, let alone a jar of 20 to 30 gallons or 6, right? This is a huge, huge amount. So the details of that and the fact that it was filled to the brim help teach us about something that John wants us to listen for. We see that Jesus has the power to turn water into wine, the miracle itself, but we also see that he does so on an abundant and extravagant level. This is revealing, we hear here, that the glory of God, the presence of God, the works of God, and the result was that the disciples believed in Jesus. They believed that Jesus was the revealer of God. So that's another kind of interesting detail there, is that Jesus' mother told the servants, "Do what Jesus tells you to do." And these servants, they follow. They do what Jesus tells them. They fill the water jugs. In fact, they fill it up to the brim, and then they take it. And so they're in there following what Jesus has told them, this miracle happens. So another way that we could look at this miracle story in John is, what about when we, as servants of Jesus, do what Jesus tells us to? What if then miracles happen, right? When we do what Jesus tells us to, miraculous things can happen. And so maybe, what does that mean for you? You can kind of discern. What might that mean for you, to do what Jesus tells you to do? And maybe that's taking a risk and volunteering in a new way. Maybe there's a way that you've been convicted of that you know you're being disobedient to what God is calling you to do. And what would it mean in that area to do what Jesus tells us to do? What good work might God do in your life by being obedient in there? Some of the ways in which we hear Jesus telling us what to do, well, this is later in John. In John 13, we hear Jesus telling us to love others as Jesus has loved us. And that's a pretty big, deep, extravagant love, right? So maybe, what would that mean to maybe welcome someone new into your life? Maybe welcome a child and mentor someone new. Or maybe to speak the truth in love to someone, even though that's difficult and hard, but that might lead towards a richer relationship together, a better ministry or work experience together. What might it mean to maybe love others, even though they might misunderstand you, and to pray for them? We think of Jesus praying for the world, the same world that brought him to the cross. We see of Jesus, too, on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so we also hear Jesus calling us to forgiveness. And not just one time or two times, right, but this extravagant number of times, 77 times, which can be kind of seen as almost an unlimited way of forgiving others. And that's not easy, but if we follow and do what Jesus says, what miraculous things might God do? I think of a relationship I had. There was a friend of ours who made some really big mistakes. And those mistakes caused us a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. And I think we tried to forgive this person, but every time something would come up that would remind us of the mistakes that he had made and the ways in which we'd been hurt by him, we brought that stuff out again, and we used it as ammunition in the present, reminding him again and again of what he had done and how much he had hurt us. And that is not really forgiving, not really loving and forgiving in the way that Jesus loves and forgives us. But in the face of that love and forgiveness that Jesus gives us, what might it look like to truly love and forgive others as Christ has forgiven you? And in doing so, in doing what Jesus tells us to do, miraculous things happen, right? So maybe there can be some real forgiveness and reconciliation and restored relationship in places where you thought it might be impossible. That is a taste of the abundant life that Jesus gives. Another thing that Jesus tells us to do is to go, and in our going, to make disciples, tell others what we have been taught by Jesus, to tell others what God is doing in our lives or what we've been learning lately. Maybe that means to take a risk. Maybe invite someone to your small group. Maybe it means to share with a coworker about what God's been teaching you lately. And in doing so, trusting that God will give you the words to say. Maybe God will do the miraculous and give faith in Jesus to those you share your story of faith with. So that's, again, one way. There's lots of ways to look at these different miracles in John, but that idea of doing what Jesus has told us to and the miraculous things that might happen. As we look at this story in John 2, again, that abundance of what Jesus has done with the wine. And this is at a wedding, right? This is a party. You can too kind of look at it from that celebration that they're a part of together. And think of maybe the most recent meaningful wedding that you've been to. And what was that like? Sometimes weddings, maybe there was some extravagance with the wedding. Maybe it lasted one day. Maybe it lasted a whole kind of wedding event weekend of 3 days. In this time, weddings would have been like a whole week long. Families would have saved for this for a lot of their life, to have a special time where they could host all of their friends and family and provide food for them and drink for them. And it was also, hospitality then was so important. I think of a wedding I went to of a friend, and it was an outside wedding in this beautiful location. And then after the marriage ceremony, then they had hors d'oeuvres and like an orchestra playing. And then after we were there, then we went to the main reception, and it was a plated, served meal Very nice. And then they had a full-out 80s cover band for the music for the night, complete with the band doing like costume changes multiple times throughout the night. People were out dancing and having fun. And then at about 11 o'clock at night, they brought out the pizza and the chocolate fountain. And I mean, it was kind of extravagant. But it's like this kind of image of abundance. I think of my sister's wedding, definitely not extravagant in that same way, but what a joy it was to be gathered with your just favorite people, right? Your friends and your family, and you're dancing and you're sharing stories. And I think of the bridegroom, my brother-in-law, John, and he got out on that dance floor. I've never seen him dance like that ever. We can't even hardly get him on a dance floor now. But that night, he just busted a move all over the place. He was so excited, and people were out dancing with him, and it was such a celebration. You see this image of a wedding. This is the very first sign in John. And why a wedding? Why all this wine? Why the abundance? But it's this party, right? And it points us. So in this reading, we have the bridegroom being kind of extolled for this abundant gift of hospitality and celebration. And it points us then to the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, and the joy and life and abundance that is offered through Jesus Christ. And the party that we have in community with one another. The abundance of life, and wine can be a symbol of life. In the scripture, it's also a symbol of the salvation to come. In the Old Testament, sometimes it is when God is restoring the people, it talks about wine dripping from the mountains. It's this image of abundant wine and life and the salvation that God is bringing. And so we see this party that we are invited to. In John, there is no kind of words of institution, no Last Supper, where they do the breaking of the bread and the wine in the same way. But we have this miracle story, and we have the miracle story of the feeding of the 5,000, where a few loaves of bread is abundantly shared as well. And so you can kind of see John's image of communion when we gather together at the table, of being invited into the life and joy of Jesus. Maybe picture my brother-in-law dancing his heart out at the party, right? There's this joy with Jesus that we're invited into with communion. And communion is a foretaste of that, but then it's also it's a foretaste of the heavenly joy, that life that begins now and is an eternal, never-ending life with Jesus. So again, that's one other way to look at that sign, looking at the kind of the different things, clues that John gives us to point to that. And the other sign that we're looking at today is from John chapter 9. It's a healing miracle where the man confesses, "I was blind, but now I see." As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." And so right there, we can pause and see that Jesus is actually correcting a common misunderstanding of why bad things happen to good people. Suffering is not a punishment from God. In the midst of our suffering, though, there can be an opportunity for God's works to be revealed. And we can see that as God brings healing, or as God provides refuge for us in the midst of our struggles. We can see that as we get to encourage another person, and that's God's works being revealed. We can maybe share our own story of God's presence with us through a difficult time, and how that might strengthen someone else's faith. And again, that's God's works being revealed. So we'll continue on. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some were saying, it is he. Others were saying, no, but it is someone like him. He kept saying, I am the man. But they kept asking him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. The man who was born blind continues to grow in his understanding of who Jesus is. And then later in the story, we hear Jewish leaders interrogating the man. And so we hear, so for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Talking of Jesus. And the blind man answered, I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And then they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us? And they drove him out. We hear later that Jesus goes out to this man and kind of restores him to community with the disciples. But we see here that this blind man is the one who sees that, right, that Jesus is the light. There's kind of imagery of light and blindness a lot in this story. And it's the blind man who sees that Jesus is from God, and that the work that Jesus does is from God. And the Jewish leaders claim to see, but they are calling Jesus a sinner, and they say that he is not from God. And so as we think about this spiritual sight, is really what this is talking about. So on the surface level, it's a miracle story about a man who now was blind but now can see. But the signs, kind of the points within that, the clues within it, show that this is a sign pointing to us about what it means to spiritually see who Jesus is, and to recognize that what Jesus does reveals God, to recognize that Jesus' works are God's works. And so we also see that this blind man does, similar to the servants in the first miracle story, he does what Jesus tells him to do. He is obedient. He goes and washes. He confesses that Jesus has done this in his life. He's able to see that Jesus comes from God. So what about for us? Maybe we can hear a challenge there. In what ways might we be spiritually blind, unable to see God in Jesus Christ, unable to trust Jesus and obey what he says? In those times where we are able to see God, it is by God's amazing grace that we see and recognize that Jesus is from God. And we see this grace also in baptism. So this sign also kind of reveals something about the sacrament, this sacrament of baptism. So he's washing, and then he can see. We also see that in the life of Paul in the New Testament. It's after he washes that then, and is baptized, that then he can see. So it points us to the grace that we receive from God in baptism. So in our baptism, we are washed clean from the dirt of sin so that we can have eyes of faith and see God. So again, that's just one other way to look at this sign and what it points us to as far as who Jesus is and what this means for us, what his life means for us. So this is just a beginning as we're looking at John, really just a beginning of these two signs. And there's other signs, miraculous signs in John to look at. We encourage you to be looking through and reading John throughout this series. And there's some specific passages we encourage you to look at and some questions to reflect on. And as we do so, we're thinking about kind of what is the surface level maybe of the story, what is the deeper meaning of what that it's pointing us to, what is John trying to tell us. And we're asking ourselves three questions. Who is this man Jesus? How does this affect my life? And what response am I called to? So if we think about that within the two miracle stories we looked at today, who is this man Jesus? This is the Son of God. Jesus reveals who God is. Jesus reveals what God is like. Jesus does the work of God. And some ways we can think about how this might affect our life. Jesus invites you to participate in his joy, to have abundant life with him that begins right now. Jesus invites you into an adventure of seeing God at work. And then to think about what response am I called to? Some possibilities would be to believe, to trust that Jesus is the Son of God, to see that Jesus does the work of God and is revealing who God is to you. Also to do what Jesus says, to love one another, to forgive extravagantly, and to enjoy the abundant life that Jesus gives you. So as we do that, we're reflecting on, who this amazing God is that gives us an amazing, abundant grace and life. Amen. We're going to transition now into offering to God what God has first given us through our offering. We invite you to put a completed welcome card in the offering plate as it comes by.